pew to get started. So, welcome everyone. We're going to continue on with our study of Samson tonight. And counting tonight, we only have 3 Wednesdays left in the quarter. So I'm becoming less and less confident that we'll get through the entire book of Judges. I'm going to do my best to get through Samson tonight and next week, but I'm not even confident in that. So I try to condense it a little bit and shorten where we didn't even read every single verse. But the more I tried to condense out, the more I saw we really couldn't do it. Couldn't really justify that. So, but we'll get through it as best we can. Try to get through maybe Samson next week. Not going to rush it, but and maybe summarize the last several chapters at the end. All right, so we're in Judges chapter 14. Last week we completed studying not as nearly as thorough as we could have, obviously, but Samson's birth and the circumstances surrounding that and his Nazirite vow. So now we're going to spend tonight studying about Samson and all the events surrounding his Philistine life. So if we're going to start reading in chapter 14, we're going to read the first 9 verses to start with. Now Samson went down to Timnah and saw a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. So he went up and told his father and mother, saying, I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as a wife. Then his father and mother said to him, Is there no woman among the daughters of your brethren, or among all my people, that you must go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? And Samson said to his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. But his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord, that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. For at that time the Philistines had dominion over Israel. So Samson went down to Timnah with his father and mother, and came to the vineyards of Timnah. Now to his surprise a young lion came roaring against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he tore the lion apart as one would have torn apart a young goat, though he had nothing in his hand. But he did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Then he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. After some time, when he returned to get her, he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, a swarm of bees and honey were in the carcass of the lion. He took some of it in his hands and went along, eating. When he came to his father and mother, he gave some to them, and they also ate. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. Okay, so the map I've got here is showing the events. The upper red line shows the kind of the path of the events of where all the events in chapter 14 and 15 take place. The text says that Samson started out saying he went down to Timnah. You notice on the map that Timnah is just slightly north into the west of Zorah, where Samson lived. And this is just kind of something to point out that a lot of times when you read, there's a lot of critics that when they talk about directions in the Bible, there's people who say that's evidence of the Bible not being accurate, not being the Word of God. It's when they went down, they would say, well, Timnah's not down, it's to the west. Well, if you look in terms of elevation, Timnah's in a valley area compared to Zorah. So he did go down. And that's what you typically find in cases like that. That's just kind of a food for thought. And, so he went down to Timnah. And he went there, and we're not told exactly why he went, but it was there he saw a woman from Timnah who was a Philistine, and decided he wanted her for his wife. Now, from what we read in the text, do you see what was Samson's motivation in his choice of this woman as wife, who actually is unnamed? We don't know her name. Is there anything in the text that would clue us into what his motivation was?
Her physical appearance.
Yes. Now, there's in verse 3 and verse 7 says she pleased him well, and basically that just meant there that seemed right, looked good to him. He's very her appearance. And there are a couple things that made me think of is with the 2 times in Judges where it says that everyone did what was right in their own eyes. That thought came to mind that there's the focus seems to be in Samson here and throughout really the book of Judges that the general focus of the people was not on God. It was on things that pleased them, things that looked right and seemed right to them. We'll go and read one of these verses from Proverbs, see what the Bible has to say about that. Both of the verses say the same thing. We'll turn to Proverbs chapter 14. quote it. Let's try to get there and read it. My fingers will cooperate. Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. Okay? So, applying to what we're going to find out later about Samson, did it turn out well? Everything turned out well for Samson even in this event? And maybe you might want to qualify what you mean by well. I mean, ultimately, we see this attitude that he has ended up in his death. But him focusing more on himself and what seemed right to him, what was pleasing to him, his circumstances, we're going to see, just didn't really turn out well for him. Things did not turn out the way I think it would be pleasing to God. All right. Another thing I wanted to point out that the response of his father and mother. And curious to know what your thoughts would be, where they say that there's no woman among the daughters of your brethren. In other words, is there not an Israelite, so that you have to go and get a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? I'm kind of cueing. I mean, some of the just maybe the way it sounds like they might have said this, but also using the term uncircumcised Philistines. What are some thoughts about what there might have been in it going through their mind?
Not one of God's chosen.
Right.
Yeah. What was circumcision to the Israelites?
The covenant,
Right.
or a mark of the
Right.
covenant.
Yeah, it was a sign of their covenant with God. And so perhaps that was what they were thinking of. And any other thoughts? It could be more than one thing, but when I read that, it almost sounds like they've got this attitude like those Philistines. Not just that they were not God's people, but they were also occupying Israel. They were, they were oppressing Israel at the time. So probably kind of a double whammy there. That they're just like, really, you can't find somebody among our own people, and then you got to go to our oppressors who are also not in a covenant relationship with God. See that would seem to be their attitude. That did not seem to deter Samson at all. He said, "No, she pleases me. Go get her for me." The next thing I wanted to kind of talk about and point out was that in verse 4, despite what his parents thought about this, I thought this was interesting that it was pointed out. It said his father and mother did not know that it was of the Lord that he was seeking an occasion to move against the Philistines. So, in what way could you say these actions or this attitude of Samson was of the Lord? Any thoughts?
It almost seems to me in this particular case is God is using unrighteousness to get what he wants.
Right.
Not that what Samson did was the right thing.
Yeah, it's obviously not the case that God made Samson do this. Nothing in that term. God's all knowing. He's omniscient. He knows everything. He knows our hearts. He knows how we're made. And this, I'll maybe go back to the whole motivation of choosing Samson in the first place, even before he was born, to be the deliverer of Israel. Knowing how Samson was going to play out in situations like this, God can is akin to providence. God can use anything in our lives to accomplish His will. Knowing the way Samson is going to react, and choosing him, perhaps that was what this is referring to. That God was, taking that as an opportunity to begin the deliverance of Israel, knowing how He was ultimately going to act in this case. Yeah, babe.
Well, it's kind of like, I think, the way that God used Pharaoh.
Right.
Pharaoh achieved his purposes. Now, he didn't want to.
Right.
It wasn't his plan. He resisted at every turn, but he achieved God's purposes.
Right. Yeah, I believe that's exactly what's taking place here.
Just,
Yeah, sure.
I think it's just another example of what we see in all the Judges, that God's trying to show his people that if you'll follow me, I'll deliver you with anybody. Doesn't matter who it is, you just gotta follow me and I'll take care of you.
And so, you know, when we read about the remaining events in life, we have the events we have in the life of Samson to read about. You know, we keep that in mind that all the, you know, maybe it's the bad decisions or the even selfish decisions that we see Samson making. Ultimately, this was used by God to begin delivering Israel from the Philistines. All right. Now, the events of him killing the lion. Let's see what I had. Okay. So, when he killed this lion, he ended up coming back after some time and found inside its carcass, you know, bees and honey. And we talked about his Nazirite vow, that he was not supposed to go near anything dead. And we had just some discussion about that last week about when he actually killed the lion. But it's really at this point when he returns to the lion that I think is probably more of a problem, perhaps, with his Nazirite vow. It was when it attacked him, you know, he really had probably no choice but to defend himself and to kill it. But at this point, he voluntarily went in and took the honey out of the carcass of this lion. So, you know, this guy, he really kind of disregarded his Nazirite vow, very blatantly. And then something I hadn't really paid much attention to before in the past, that when he, you know, what did he do to the honey? With honey, he gave some to his parents, right? But again, he didn't tell them where he got it from. So he deceived them in this as well. All right. Any comments before we move on? No question.
You can tell too the fact that he didn't tell them, he knew exactly what he was doing.
Yes.
And he knew they would have a problem with it.
Right.
So he didn't say anything.
Right.
So,
And we kind of see that attitude in the whole story of Samson. He just seems to have that attitude about him. All right. Let's go and read verses 10 through 14. Someone could read that.
His father went down to the woman, and Samson prepared a feast there, for so the young men used to do. As soon as the people saw him, they brought 30 companions to be with him, and Samson said to them, "Let me now put a riddle to you. If you can tell me what it is within the 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes. But if you cannot tell me what it is, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothes." And they said to him, "Put your riddle, that we may hear it." And he said to them, "Out of the eater came something to eat, out of the strong came something sweet." And in 3 days they could not solve the riddle.
All right. So at the wedding feast of Samson and his wife, which again is unnamed, I thought one thing I thought was interesting. I was doing some research, and the word that's used here for feast is kind of implies not just a feast, as in food, a banquet, but it also implies the idea of drinking involved with this. Again, another violation of his Nazirite vow. But in the process of this wedding feast, he poses a riddle to the 30 of the Philistines, to the Philistines, and as we just read, he wanted to present a riddle to them, and if they could not answer it, they would give him 30 changes of clothing. If they could, he would give them 30 changes of clothing, and he presents them this riddle. And the next few verses, this is one about I think we're probably familiar enough with the story. What happens after this? Over the course of over the rest of the wedding feast.
It didn't go all that well.
No. It said, for 3 days they could not explain the riddle. Now this is where something I just ran across very recently, just did not caught my attention before. This is where we probably should just read all this. But in verse 15 it said, and I'm reading from the New King James translation, it says, "But it came to pass on the 7th day that they said to Samson's wife to entice her husband to explain the riddle, or else we will burn you and your father's house with fire." So the Philistines then ultimately they threaten his wife with killing her and her family if she could not get Samson to explain the riddle or explain to them so that they could win the bet. But before we talk about that, I hadn't noticed before, but in different translations, in verse 15 it says on the fourth day, and so it depends which translation you're using. And quickly ago, I just wanted to point out the differences. I was trying to look at what the differences might be, why the differences in the text, and maybe some of them may said it's been a scribe's error or something of that nature. And I don't know if that's the case. You could study and do a lot of that, but look at the Hebrew for fourth and seventh. There's only that little bit of difference. They're quite different, but I could see if you were a scribe, perhaps you would make that mistake. And from what I've seen, the different various texts that these came from, where it's used fourth versus the seventh. Some of these are like the Masoretic is the Hebrew and an Aramaic translation. The Targum is just an Aramaic translation of the Hebrew, and then the Vulgate is a 4th century Latin translation. So depending on what they were basing their translations off of and who was transcribing it, maybe there were some errors performed there. Text that use the translated as the fourth is the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation, and then the Syriac is also an Aramaic translation, but from what I understand, Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. So it's you've got a lot of different places where possibly that could have been an error. I was just curious about that. How similar were the words? If somebody were to try to transcribe these, could they have made an error? And I think I could have done that without much trouble. So this is a curiosity, but it's something to point out, to note that there are those differences. Based on what's come to follow, the fourth seems to make more sense to me in the text. Back up to that. Because it says that she asked, in verse, let's see. In verse 17, it says, "Now while she wept on him the 7 days while the feast lasted." Okay, so for the 7 days of the feast, she was trying to get the answer out of him from day one. And so it says that on the 7th day, the Philistines came to her and told her, we're going to burn your house, you and your house and your family down if you don't get the solution to this riddle to us. So she had already been trying to get the answer for him, told why that was the case. And since it was after 3 days, it said they could not explain the riddle. So a fourth day may make more sense, that after 3 days they saw they weren't going to do it, so they went to her. So either way, it doesn't really change the story much, but the fourth seems to maybe make a little more sense to me. But at any rate, they came to her and made that threat. But Samson finally told her, and we know that, and it says in verse 17, and it happened on the 7th day that he told her because she pressed him so much. Okay, so I could imagine, for 7 days he's hearing this constant pressing for him to get the answer, and he finally gives in. And so we see then after that, on the 7th day, the day before the sun went down. So it appears that they intentionally waited till like the last minute to tell him the answer to this riddle, and perhaps to make him think that he had won. But they give the answer: what is sweeter than honey, and what is stronger than a lion, in verse 18. So then his response may sound kind of strange to us, but he said to them, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my mystery, my riddle. Any thoughts about why the wording there? To us, that sounds kind of bad. we wouldn't want to say that today. We'd probably get in trouble, wouldn't we?
It's a fair inference. I think it goes back to the early verses where it talks about her appearance, and he lusted after her because of how she looked. Well, if he's objectifying her in that way, then the bitterness that goes with that statement makes a lot of sense.
Good. And some other comments I'd read on this also said that and I'm not a farmer by any means, so I don't know. I'm assuming this is right. You don't plow with a heifer. Saying that's something normally the heifers aren't used for plowing, or at least weren't then. I don't know about now. And so the idea is that he accused him basically of misusing his wife, of abusing her by making this threat, which we're not told that he was told about the threat. But it was obvious. It had been obvious to him what had happened. That, she kept pressing him, and he told her, and they magically solved the riddle. So he wasn't any dummy. He figured this out, and so he accused them of misusing his wife. And then that leads to the next event, and that is the burning of the ultimately the burning of the Philistine fields. But in the immediate time frame, we're in verse 19. Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon him mightily, and he went down to Ashkelon and killed 30 of their men, took their apparel, and gave the changes of clothing to those who had explained the riddle. So his anger was aroused, and he went back up to his father's house. And Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. We'll just back that off for a second. So this is something I've got. If we have time later on, I want to look into this idea of the Spirit of the Lord. After we talked about that, Curtis, that night, I started looking into it a little more, and it is a very good study. Still didn't get very deep into it, and that's something we will see in the story of Samson more than we see in other places where that phrase is used. It's pretty obvious in the case of Samson that this is a miraculous event, because every time that phrase is used, Samson does something just unhuman that a normal human cannot do. So he went down to Ashkelon. We see there how far he had to go from Timnah all the way down the common road there to Ashkelon to kill 30 Philistines to get their clothing. Now I don't know why he would went all the way to Ashkelon. I'm sure there are 30 Philistines in Timnah or even Ekron nearby. There's somebody he could have gone to kill them. So I'm not sure why he went down to Ashkelon. I don't know if anybody has any insight into that. I don't know if from history there might have been some reason to go there. I don't know. I don't know if maybe they were wealthier there and had better clothing or something. I don't know.
I just wonder what state the clothing was in after he killed 30 men.
Right. I wonder what he do to them. So yes, a lot of unanswered questions there. So then it said that he went back to his father's house, and that kind of leads into the next events that we read. It said Samson's wife was given to his companion, who had been his best man. So, and if we're going to read into 15, we'll kind of see some insight into why that might have happened. So let's, if someone would read the first 5 verses of chapter 15. After a while, in the time of wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat, and he said, "Let me go into my wife, into her room." But her father would not permit him to go in. Her father said, "I really thought that you thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead." And Samson said to them, "This time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them." Then Samson went and caught 300 foxes, and he took torches, turned the foxes tail to tail, and put a torch between each pair of tails. When he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines, and burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. Okay, so the burning of the Philistine fields. The question is, what prompted his action? What prompted him to do this? We'll talk about what he did too, but what prompted this?
Well, the events they just talked about, they had taken advantage of his wife's poor character, I guess is the best way of saying it, and humiliated, to a certain extent, Samson, and then he retaliated. And this just goes on to say that it's not quite done yet.
Right. Yeah. And also, we said that he went back to his father's house, and they gave Samson's wife to his companion. And in verse 15 starts, says, after a while, he returned to her father's house. So apparently he had been, he left the feast before really everything was completed. And I don't not have a deep knowledge of the customs, but a long feast time was the common thing to do then. And so when he left to go get kill the Philistines, to get the changes of clothes, then returned and then went to his father's house. It's like he left his responsibilities and what the normal traditions were in a marriage feast at that time, and then came back sometime later. So in Samson's eyes, he was married to this woman, but apparently in her father's eyes, they were not. He said, "I thought you thoroughly hated her, basically because you didn't come back." So he thought he had abandoned her, and so he gave her to his companion, said, who had been his best man. So there's several things that are going on here. It's almost hard to describe. It's almost comical. But the whole idea, like you said, Curtis, of them kind of misusing and threatening his wife, and all of those events, and also the idea that he thought he was still married, and our father had given her away. So that prompted this event, and this is again another one of those feats of strength that no normal human could do. I've got a lot of questions here about one. How do you catch 300 foxes? Okay, I can see I can see if you did it right, you could catch one at a time or two at a time in a trap or something. Okay, you could do that, but
I'm pretty sure you had help with that too.
yeah, I'm sure.
Spirit of the Lord.
Right.
Yes,
That's what I'm
but
thinking.
300 of them, and then I'm thinking you're just going to tie their tails together and put a torch in there. I don't know too many people could probably pull that off.
Fighting with a cat.
Right. Yeah. One of those is bad enough. So I mean, I could imagine 2 foxes. That's quite something to do.
It's such a crazy story.
It is.
I'm doing the whole time when I read that, I was just like, I'd just take a torch and
Right.
drop it in the field.
Right. I just think what was going through his mind. He said, "I'm going to catch some foxes, tie their tails together, and put a torch in there and set some fields on fire."
There's 300.
Right. It's pretty creative. So
It's amazing.
yes, hard to imagine how he came up with that idea. But nonetheless, he did do that. And so it says he burned up the stalks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and olive groves. So I imagine that just really decimated their fields in that area. And obviously then the Philistines were pretty upset. We read in verse 6, "Then the Philistines said, 'Who has done this?' And they answered, 'Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion.' So the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire." So they did what they're, one way or another, they were that's what was going to happen. Despite their, she getting past their first threat, they still were not happy the way things turned out. And so they went through with their threat and burned her and her father in their house with fire. So then verse 7, Samson said to them, "Since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that I will cease." So he attacked them with hip and thigh with a great slaughter. Then he went down and dwelt in the cleft at the rock of Edom. And I don't think that actually shows up on this map here. So again, we see this just continuing. And this is where it goes back to the idea, that this thing was of God, and God, knowing Samson's demeanor and how he would react to things, he seems to be a bit of a hothead. He's kind of brash. This act of revenge keeps going back and forth between them. So we aren't told exactly how many he killed. He killed them, attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter. So again, that's a very large number of people. So he went down and dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. So after that, we read that now the Philistines went up and camped in Judah and deployed themselves against Lehi. And actually, Lehi is right down over here. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" So they answered, "We have come up to arrest Samson to do to him as he has done to us." So exactly where this the rock of Edom is apparently in the area of Lehi. So again, they were going to try to take revenge on Samson for taking revenge for them taking revenge. You see this? That's the way revenge works, right? It never ends. So then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you have done?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." But they said to him, "We have come down to arrest you that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." So their response is they were going to arrest Samson to take care of his problem, because they just, in their eyes, imagined that they knew that the Philistines were going to exact revenge upon all of them as well. Then Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." So they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely and deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they bound him with 2 new ropes and brought him up from the rock. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting against him. Then the Spirit of the Lord came up mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arms became like flax that is burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose with his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, reached out his hand and took it, and killed 1,000 men with it. Then Samson said, "With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men." And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and called that place Ramath Lehi. Then he became very thirsty, so he cried out to the Lord and said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised?" So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank. And his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore he called its name En-Hakkore, which is in Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines. All right. So the events of him killing I said 3,000, it's 1,000. I hit a wrong number there. Philistines with the donkey's jawbone. I was going to say what prompted this action. We've already read that. Again, is just this continued act of revenge with the Philistines that prompted his actions. But in the meantime, again, we see the idea of the Spirit of the Lord coming after he was bound, and those ropes, it said it became a flax that was burned with fire. So he burst right through those ropes. Again, another act of inhuman strength.
Have you thought about how long it took him to kill him? Was he killing him at a rate of like 1 a minute? You know? It's a long time to kill 1,000 people.
Or maybe got two at a time with the swing. I don't know.
So I guess he was thirsty.
Yeah. And with that idea, again, I see the way when he called out to the Lord, said, "You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant." So you see on one hand that he recognizes that God was behind all of this and behind his strength. But then also, when he says that now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised, still I see a bit of kind of an arrogance in his tone, and just like God, you've done all this too, and now you're just going to let me die? It kind of reminds me of is Elijah that after killed all the prophets of Baal, and he was obviously very tired, and had that same kind of an attitude. So I don't know, maybe we would call it arrogance more than just worn out and not thinking well, but at least we do see here that he does at least recognize that God is behind this, behind his strength. All right, let's see. Yeah, okay, we just mentioned that. It seemed to be possibly a self-serving attitude in that tone that we read there. Now we've talked about this a little bit, but how were all of these events part of God's plan for Israel's deliverance? We've probably really kind of touched on that a lot, but each of these events, what are your thoughts about how this is part of God's plan?
He allows like an intensification of things. So it starts off and it's just 30 people, and then it's like 100 people, and then it's 1,000, and then 3,000 men of Judah show up, and then like the numbers just keep getting bigger.
Right.
So it escalates quickly.
Well, from a big picture standpoint, the Philistines were a huge threat. They were dominating the whole Mediterranean at the time, and they would have wiped out probably the remnants of what was there from the Israelites. So God's plan to use Samson to at least beat them down, beat them back, was significant. And it's almost like he had to escalate it all the way up to the level of the 1,000 men getting killed before they would back down. Because then they did. In 20 years, Samson was able to be a judge. But the Philistines at that time in history were They were the first to discover and start using iron. They were very, very significant, and probably would have wiped out the Jews because they were bordering with them.
And now, what you're saying, this is something again I just now thought of, so I didn't have a chance to look into it. But I imagine that Israel probably, if they had gone up against them in full force, it probably would not have stood a chance.
Right, that's right.
Yeah, and so with like the escalating these levels, it at least gets a foothold and probably at least made. I'm sure that by this time the Philistines were probably a little bit of afraid of Samson. They could see what he could do.
Where would he live? It wasn't like, sending a whole group out of people would be one thing, but to leave you alone, send one person, and then God come upon him multiple times to kill them all, that's a whole different message.
Right.
One person doing it all.
Right.
The group.
Yeah, Gideon didn't need an army of 20,000 men, right? He just needed 300.
Right.
And now we see that God just needed one
Yeah.
in this sense.
Yeah, good point. Yeah. And again, going back to the way Samson conducted himself and the way he reacted to things, that all factors into that too. God knew that he was going to be that way. And it's come hard to fathom and to really think about. But yeah, that's all parts and plays into God's plan. And if you remember back at the beginning of the story of Samson, it said before he was born, he told his parents that he would begin to deliver Israel. So that's one thing we're going to see, that it was not a complete deliverance in Samson's time, but he would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. Again, that plays out of the escalation of the numbers and how that eventually played out. All right, we've just got a couple of minutes left. I guess we can go ahead and get started just a little bit on the next last chapter in the story of Samson, chapter 16, is the story of Samson and Delilah and these events surrounding his death. So we'll go read the first few verses, starting in verse 1. Now Samson went to Gaza and saw a harlot there and went into her. When the Gazites were told Samson has come here, they surrounded the place and lay await for him all night at the gate of the city. They were quiet all night, saying, "In the morning, when it is daylight, we will kill him." And Samson lay low until midnight, and he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the 2 gate posts, pulled them up, bar and all, put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Okay, that's quite a lot said in those couple of verses. We'll talk more about the gates next week, but to point out now again, it says Samson went to Gaza. And again, it's the same wording, so that he intentionally went there. He had some purpose in going. We don't know why, which seems kind of odd in some ways to me, because these Timnah and then Gaza, those were both Philistine cities. Not sure what business he would have thought he had there, but he went there intentionally and said he saw a harlot and went into her. Perhaps that was part of the reason. Before the events of him taking the gates, we're going to talk a little bit about what those gates would have looked like, at least in size and weight and that sort of thing. The Philistines decided they lived in Gaza were going to lay in wait for him and kill him in the morning. Now, I'm not sure why they were planning on waiting till the morning instead of just going and taking him. And maybe they thought they'd catch him right before he woke up or something of that nature, so they could surprise him. We're not told those kind of details. But at this point, like I said, everybody knew who Samson was at this point. They were told that Samson's here. I don't imagine that much explanation was needed. I'm sure word had gotten out very quickly who Samson was. All right. I guess we'll go and stop there for tonight and pick up talking more about the city gates. And when you read about find out what the size of those city gates were typically like and the weight and everything, it really just blew my mind when they really start looking at what God did through Samson with these gates. It's pretty amazing. All right, I guess the bell should be ringing in a minute now. So does anybody have any other thoughts or questions or anything? Probably have to save most of the answer or anything until next week, but something we can at least give us something to think about. All right. Thank you very much.
Good Wednesday evening to the number we have here in attendance, and we certainly appreciate everyone being here for our midweek Bible study. We're getting ready to begin the devotional period of our evening, and our first song leader will be Weston Adams. Our speaker for this evening will be Dennis Lawson. Rex Sims will lead us in the song of invitation, after which Andrew Corder will have a closing prayer. And following Andrew's prayer, I'll have a few closing announcements before we dismiss for the evening. So let's go ahead and begin now.
You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depth of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above, and I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you. You are beautiful beyond description, too marvelous for words, too wonderful for comprehension, like nothing ever seen or heard. Who can grasp your infinite wisdom? Who can fathom the depth of your love? You are beautiful beyond description, majesty enthroned above, and I stand in awe of you. I stand in awe of you. Holy God, to whom all praise is due, I stand in awe of you.
Rusty not this past Sunday night, but a week ago, this past Sunday night, gave an excellent lesson, I think, on the topic of faith. This evening, if you would, take a look at Matthew chapter 14. There's a lot going on in Matthew chapter 14. King Herod hears of Jesus' works. He believes that John the Baptist has risen from the dead. And Herod is the one that just recently, in the past short period, had been the one that beheaded John the Baptist. John the Baptist, he was bold, he was courageous, and he was faithful. And what did it get him? What did it cost John the Baptist? It cost him his life. The rest of chapter 14 of Matthew records what Jesus' actions were after hearing of John's death. He first sought seclusion, but he was also drawn by compassion. the compassion to keep on healing the people that were brought to him. He fed the 5,000 with only 5 loaves and 2 fish. He then sends his disciples out in a boat, and he goes up to a mountaintop to pray, and then comes to them walking on the water. He commands Peter to come out of the boat to him. Peter becomes frightened. And Jesus asked him and all the disciples why they continued to doubt him. As I said, there was a lot that went on in chapter 14. No doubt Jesus was deeply grieved by his cousin's death. After all, John gave his life to preach the truth, even though he opposed some very powerful people, even those that had the power to take his life away. I think the rest here also is that Jesus has some challenges for us. He's effectively saying, in this case, I think, my cousin just died for this cause. Jesus is looking for results. He is looking for results. What does he expect from us, his followers? That includes me, that includes you. Those who follow him, what does he expect of us? The main thing, I believe, is to grow in faith, to move past the doubts, to be challenged by his power and the sacrifices that he made on our behalf. A few months ago, I think back in last year sometime, I gave another Devo. The Devo at that time was on Matthew chapter 14. And specifically, verses 30 and 31. The picture that I used at that point was to illustrate this point. You'll notice the boat being tossed to and fro in the water. Jesus is there pulling Peter out of the water. But if you read that particular account, at the end of that section in verses 32 and 33, when did the storm subside? It wasn't until Peter got back into the boat. He and Jesus walked on that stormy water back to the boat. Was Peter's faith restored? Did Peter grow in faith from that time? Think about these questions quickly for me. What kind of faith must John have had to preach morality to one who had the power to end his life? Do we have that kind of courage? Are you comfortable with Christ expecting deeper trust from you? Remember, that's part of faith. Belief, trust, motivates to action. Would you have asked to walk on the water to Jesus if you had been in that boat? And I think more crucial is, what does that faith look like? What does our faith look like when we are assailed by the storms of life today? Rusty's sermon, I think, bears out these questions. What kind of faith do we have? Are we comfortable with what Jesus expects from us? And would our faith lead us to ask, as Peter did in verse 28, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. Peter had belief. And at that point, Peter trusted, and it motivated him to get out of that boat. Would we be motivated into that kind of action? Is there some action that you may need to take this evening? If there is, we're waiting to pray with you and for you if you need to come back to Jesus. And the angels in heaven as well as us are waiting to rejoice if you want to put on Christ in baptism. If there's anything that we can do for you this evening, we ask that you come now as we stand and sing.
If for the price we have striven, after our labors are o'er, rescue our souls will be given on the eternal shore. All the soul of the beautiful, there we shall rest, never to grow, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there.
Y'all bow with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for allowing us to come tonight as we hear a portion from your word, as we can take what was presented to us through the whole book of Matthew. Let us remember about that book that a lot of information was given to us that we can go out and do better for you and bring others back to you. Please continue to watch over our sick at this time, as a lot of our number here, we know that the doctors and nurses with them, we hope that you give them that strength to get them back to their best form of health and come back to us. Be with us as we leave tonight, as we go out into this rain, as though it is needed, but be careful with us as we drive to our homes. As we go back to this week, as we go back to our jobs or our schools, be with those with us as we can encourage others to know you more. Bring us back to the next appointed time. In Jesus' name, amen.